April 16th, 1944, 7:18 a.m. The early morning sky above the coast of England was a cold grey canvas, stretched thin with drifting clouds. Below, the vast expanse of the North Sea shimmered under the pale light, indifferent to the tension that gripped the crew of B-17 flying Fortress Liberty Bell. The bomber had just returned from a grueling mission over Nazi-occupied France. Inside the cramped cockpit, pilot Captain James "Jim" Reynolds gripped the controls with white-knuckled intensity. The plane was badly damaged. One engine was on fire. Another sputtered weakly, and the hydraulic systems were failing. The radio crackled with emergency signals from the crew, who were desperately fighting to keep the aircraft stable. Behind them, the bomb bay doors were jammed open, making the craft vulnerable to wind and slowing its speed. The fuel gauges were dangerously low, and smoke filled the cabin. Despite the chaos, Jim's mind was sharp, focused on one goal: getting his crew home alive. Every muscle tensed as the bomber limped toward the coast. The runway at RAF Seething was the only hope, yet the field was narrow and surrounded by dense woodland. Any miscalculation would send the plane crashing into the trees, or worse, killing all aboard. Outside, the storm clouds thickened, winds gusted unpredictably, and time was running out. The silence in the cockpit was thick with fear and determination. This was no ordinary landing, it was a fight for survival. Jim took a deep breath and began the final approach. The world outside blurred as he guided the crippled giant toward a narrow strip of land. The lives of 8 men depended on his skill, his nerve, and a miracle. Captain James Reynolds was no stranger to danger. Born in Kansas in 1918, he grew up with a love for flying that only intensified as World War II engulfed the globe. After joining the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1942, Jim trained rigorously, earning his wings and quickly rising to become a trusted B-17 pilot. His crew was a tight-knit group, each man playing a vital role. Navigator Sully Sullivan, the calm voice amid chaos, calculated their flight paths with precision. Bombardier Frank Morris was the sharp-eyed marksman, while engineer Bill Carter kept the engines running despite damage and exhaustion. The gunners Tommy, Joe, and Mike watched the skies for enemy fighters with relentless vigilance. Their missions were brutal deep strikes into enemy territory, heavy anti-aircraft fire, and relentless fighter attacks. Many crews never returned, lost to flak or enemy planes, but Jim's leadership and the crew's skill had kept them alive so far. On this mission, they had targeted a crucial railway junction in France. Heavy flak had shattered their plane, leaving it crippled. Still, Jim had managed to rally the crew, maintain formation, and start the perilous journey back across the channel. Each man understood the stakes. There was no room for panic or error. Their survival depended on Jim's ability to land the plane against all odds. As the battered Liberty Bell approached England, the tension inside thickened. The damage was worse than anticipated. One engine was barely holding, and the fire threatened to spread. The hydraulics, critical for controlling the landing gear and flaps, were erratic. The bomb bay doors remained stuck open, creating extra drag and instability. Jim's calm command kept the crew focused as they worked frantically to stabilize systems, monitor fuel, and prepare for the crash landing. Time was slipping away. At 7:30 a.m., radar indicated heavy winds at RAF Seething's airfield. The runway was too short for a normal landing, especially with the damaged B-17. Jim knew that if the plane touched down too fast or too hard, the fuselage could break apart, or worse, explode. His mind raced through every training exercise, every simulator run. This was no drill. He had to improvise. With the aircraft limping in, Jim made a daring decision to use a steep approach angle, descending rapidly but controlled to reduce airspeed quickly. This tactic was unconventional and risky but necessary given the damaged systems. The crew held their breath as the plane shuddered on the final descent. The thick smoke in the cockpit blurred vision, but Jim's instincts took over. Using every ounce of his experience, he leveled the plane for a touchdown just short of the trees lining the runway. The impact was rough, jolting the crew but sparing them from disaster. The plane skidded along the runway, engines sputtering, sparks flying as the wheels tore into the asphalt. Jim fought the controls fiercely to keep the bomber straight. The B-17 finally came to rest with a thunderous halt, smoke pouring from the engine compartments. Silence fell for a heartbeat. Then the crew erupted into cheers and tears. 8 lives, saved against all odds. This impossible landing, born of desperate courage and quick thinking, would change how emergency landings were taught and executed. Jim Reynolds had not only saved his crew, he had rewritten the rules. The battered Liberty Belle was barely holding together, limping toward the English coastline. Captain James Reynolds knew the odds were stacked against him and his crew. The fire in the left engine was spreading, and the failing hydraulics meant the landing gear might not deploy properly. Yet, turning back was not an option. The plane was too damaged to stay airborne much longer. Inside the cockpit, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Each crew member performed their duties with precision, despite the smoke and noise. Jim's mind was racing, calculating risks and possibilities. The usual landing procedure was impossible. The runway at our FC thing was short and surrounded by dense woods. A mistake would mean disaster. Suddenly, Jim's eyes locked on the narrow strip of tarmac ahead. An idea, daring and untested, flashed in his mind. What if he tried a controlled crash landing? If he could reduce speed dramatically by cutting power early and using a steep descent, he might touch down before the trees and avoid a fiery crash. The thought was terrifying, but it was the only chance. "Gear's acting up," Engineer Bill Carter warned. "Might not come down fully." Jim nodded grimly. "We'll have to belly land if it comes to that. Stay ready." Navigator Sully Sullivan scanned the horizon. Winds shifting. "We've got about a 5-knot crosswind. Could be tricky." "Better than nothing," Jim muttered, gripping the controls. The crew braced themselves as the plane descended sharply, engines roaring against the strain. The heavy bomber shook violently, the airframe groaning under pressure. The drag from the stuck bomb bay doors made controlling speed a nightmare. "Keep it steady," Jim ordered, voice steady despite the chaos. As the runway neared, Jim pulled back gently on the yoke to slow the descent, relying on skill more than instruments. The B-17's landing gear struggled to lock down, one wheel barely clicking into place. The plane's belly scraped dangerously low. Seconds stretched like hours. The plane's wheels touched down with a bone-jarring thud, and Jim wrestled the controls to keep it on the narrow path. Sparks flew as the metal belly ground against the runway surface. Behind him, the crew clutched their seats, hearts pounding. The bomber shuddered violently as it skidded forward. Jim fought to keep it straight, muscles taut. The surrounding trees blurred past, threatening to claim them. Then, as if by miracle, the plane slowed, coming to a shuddering stop just before the tree. Silence fell for a breath, then cheers erupted. The crew had survived the impossible. The moment the Liberty Belle's wheels kissed the runway was the beginning of a relentless fight for survival. Captain Reynolds' hands were steady, but his body was exhausted from hours of tension. The plane was still at risk. Fuel tanks damaged, fires smoldering in the engines. "Prepare to evacuate," Jim commanded, voice sharp but calm. The crew moved quickly, unfastening harnesses and checking each other. Smoke thickened inside the fuselage, and the smell of burning oil filled the air. Outside, ground crews rushed toward the plane, fire trucks racing to meet them. But the danger was far from over. Any spark could ignite the remaining fuel, turning the bomber into an inferno. Engineer Bill Carter stayed behind to ensure the engines were shut down safely, despite the choking smoke. Navigator Sully helped guide the other men through the escape hatch, encouraging calm. "Stay focused. We're not out yet." Amid the chaos, the camaraderie between these men shone through. They worked as a unit, each supporting the other in the face of uncertainty. Jim was last to leave the cockpit, surveying the damage. The fuselage was crumpled, the wings battered. Yet the plane held together. Everyone accounted for. He asked, "8 souls, all here," came the reply. That day, the emergency crews praised Jim's quick thinking and remarkable skill. His unorthodox landing approach, born from desperation, had saved every man aboard. This event sparked a thorough review of emergency landing procedures across the Allied air forces. Pilots were trained to consider steep, controlled descents and belly landings as viable options under extreme circumstances. Jim's leadership and bravery had not only saved lives, but changed the future of air combat survivability. The story of the Liberty Bell became a symbol of hope and ingenuity in a war defined by destruction. The successful crash landing of the Liberty Bell on April 16, 1944, marked a turning point in the history of aerial combat and emergency procedures. Captain James Reynolds and his crew's survival against overwhelming odds was a testament to human courage and quick thinking. Their story spread rapidly among Allied airmen, offering hope amid the relentless dangers of the air war. Military analysts studied the incident in detail. They controlled crash landing, once seen as too risky, was now understood as a viable last resort tactic to save lives and valuable equipment. Training manuals were updated to include techniques for forced landings with compromised landing gear, emphasizing the importance of pilot skill and calm under pressure. Beyond tactical changes, the event highlighted the vital role of crew coordination and communication during emergencies. Reynolds' calm commands and his crew's disciplined response became a model for teamwork in crises. The Liberty Bell's survival inspired other crews to adopt innovative thinking in dire moments. It demonstrated that even in the darkest hours, resourcefulness could turn the tide between death and survival. However, the incident also underscored the extreme risks faced by bomber crews. The constant threat of mechanical failure, enemy fire, and environmental hazards meant every mission carried life or death stakes. The story served as a reminder of the sacrifices made by airmen who flew missions that shaped the outcome of World War II. Captain James Reynolds and his crew returned home as heroes, though they remained humble about their ordeal. For them, survival was the reward, but the experience left lasting impressions. The scars of war, both physical and mental, lingered long after the engines were silenced. Reynolds went on to advocate for improved pilot training and emergency preparedness, driven by a determination to save future airmen. His first-hand knowledge added urgency to reforms that saved countless lives in subsequent conflicts. For the crew, the bond forged in those terrifying minutes remained unbroken. They stayed connected, sharing stories and honoring the memories of comrades lost in other missions. Their friendship was a testament to the human spirit's resilience. The Liberty Bell itself became a symbol of endurance, featured in wartime newsreels and post-war exhibitions. Its story captured the imagination of a generation, reminding the world that heroism often hides in moments of ordinary men doing extraordinary things. Today, pilots and crews continue to study the lessons from Reynolds' crash landing. The blend of courage, skill, and teamwork remains central to military aviation doctrine. It reminds us that in war, survival depends not only on technology but on human resolve. This is the history of World War II. Whoever oppresses the innocent is an oppressor. Neither the earth belongs to this oppressor, nor does the sky belong to him. We stand, now and forever, with the oppressed. This is WWII Files. See you in the next one.